In the Arizona Territory of 1888, the land didn't make promises, it made threats. The sun was a hammer, the ground was an anvil, and a person's life was worth less than a bucket of clean water. For Abigail Finch, a widow with nothing but 160 acres of dust and a stubborn mule, survival was a full-time job. Her husband Thomas had been gone 3 years, claimed by a fever that burned as hot as the unforgiving ground he was buried in. All she had left was the one-room sod house they'd built together and a well that was starting to feel more like a grave. But on an evening when the sky bled out over the canyons, she heard a sound on the wind. It was a faint cry, thin and reedy. Most would have ignored it, chalked it up to a coyote or a trick of the wind. But this sound was different. It was human, and Abigail was about to face a choice that would pit her against the most powerful man in the county, Jedediah Thorne. Following that sound wouldn't just test her will to live. It would uncover a secret so dark it threatened to stain the canyons red and turn her simple homestead into the heart of a war. What she found in the dust would become a legend, and what she received in return would be worth more than all the gold in the territory. The cry came from the west, from the broken country of arroyos and thorny mesquite. Thorne's country. Jedediah Thorne was a man who saw the world as his personal cattle pasture. His T-Bar ranch was an empire built on swallowing up smaller homesteads. He'd come to Abigail's porch twice, his offers for her land feeling more like threats. The first time, he was all smiles and false charm, his voice a low rumble. "A woman alone, Mrs. Finch," he'd said, his eyes the color of a winter sky. "This is no place for you. Take my offer. Go back east." She'd refused, her voice quiet but firm. "My husband and I put our souls in this ground, Mr. Thorne. It's not for sale." The second time, the charm was gone. His face was a thundercloud. "That well of yours is the deepest artery in this valley," he'd snarled. "My cattle need it. Don't be a fool." His men, rough riders with cruel smirks, made a habit of riding the edge of her property line, a constant, silent threat. The sheriff in the nearby town of Red Creek, a man named Brody, was so deep in Thorne's pocket he might as well have been a gold piece. Abigail was on her own. She knew it. The whole territory knew it. Then the cry came again, sharper this time, a clear spike of pain and fear. It wasn't the wind. Every instinct screamed at her to lock her door, to ignore it. This was Thorne's land, Thorne's business. His warning about accidents echoed in her ears. Snakes, fires, loneliness. What if this was a trap, a lure to draw her out from the safety of her home? But then she thought of Thomas. She thought of the child she'd lost before it ever drew a breath. She couldn't leave another soul to suffer alone in the dark. "Damn it all," she whispered to the twilight. She stormed back inside, her movements now swift and certain. She grabbed her old Winchester rifle, not for hunting, but for the two-legged predators that roamed this land. From her medicine chest, she took bandages and a bottle of carbolic acid. She slung a canteen of precious water over her shoulder. Whatever was out there, it was hurt. And whatever happened next, she would face it. With a heavy rifle in her arms, she stepped off her porch and walked toward the sound, into the looming shadows of a world that didn't care if she lived or died. But Abigail Finch was about to give it a reason to care. The land she walked into was a maze. From her porch, it looked like rolling hills. But up close, it was a treacherous web of dry washes and thorny gullies. The ground, baked hard as pottery, crumbled under her boots, threatening to send her tumbling into the darkness with a twisted ankle. The air grew cold. The scuttling sounds of night creatures filled the silence. She was completely alone, a single point of light in an ocean of hostile black. "Hello," she called out, her voice swallowed by the immense emptiness. Only the wind answered. She pressed on, guided by memory, every nerve on fire. Her eyes scanned the shadows, not for animals, but for the glint of a rifle barrel, for the silhouette of a man on horseback. Thorne's presence felt like a physical weight on the air, a suffocating blanket of malice. After 20 minutes that felt like an hour, she found them. Tracks, the small, bare prints of a child. They were erratic, weaving back and forth as if lost, before heading straight for a dense thicket of mesquite and catclaw acacia that choked a narrow arroyo. As she drew closer, a new sound reached her, a low whimpering. It was the sound of pain so great, the body had forgotten how to scream. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, her voice pitched to soothe. "I heard you cry out. I've come to help." She pushed aside a thorny branch, the spine snagging her sleeve. And then she saw him. He was a small boy, no older than 6 or 7. His skin was the color of rich earth, his straight black hair matted with dust. He wore only a simple breechcloth. He was Hopi, but it wasn't his heritage that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. It was the thing that held him. His right leg was trapped in the cruel, rusted teeth of a coyote trap. It was an iron-jawed monster, the kind ranchers used, with a heavy chain bolted to a stake driven deep into the ground, the kind Thorne's men used. The metal teeth had bitten through the flesh of his calf, and a dark pool of blood stained the ground around him. He wasn't crying anymore. His dark, intelligent eyes were wide with terror and pain, fixed on her and the rifle she carried. He was a cornered animal, ready to fight, despite the hopelessness of his situation. This was no accident. This was a message, and Abigail had just walked right into the middle of it. "Easy now," Abigail murmured. She slowly lowered the Winchester, setting it on the ground far away from her. She held up her empty hands, showing him she meant no harm. "Easy. My name is Abigail. I'm here to get that thing off you." The boy said nothing, just watched her with an unnerving stillness, a faint tremor running through his small body. This close, she saw a small, beaded amulet around his neck, its patterns intricate and meaningful. This wasn't just some lost child. He was important. She knelt carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice full of a sympathy that needed no translation. "But we have to get it open." The trap was old and powerful. Prying the jaws apart with her bare hands was impossible. She needed leverage. Her eyes scanned the dusty ground. A few feet away lay a sturdy, sun-bleached limb of ironwood, heavy and dense. It would have to do. She retrieved the branch, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The boy flinched as she approached again, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "It's all right," she soothed, showing him the wood. "See? I'm going to use this to open it." She positioned the end of the ironwood branch between the handles of the trap's jaws. Planting her feet, she put every ounce of her strength into forcing them apart. The metal groaned in protest. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes. For a terrifying moment, she didn't think she could do it. The spring was too strong, built to snap the bones of a wolf. It was built to maim. Then with a final, desperate heave, the jaws gave way. They opened just a few inches, but it was enough. "Now," she grunted. "Pull your leg out, quick!" The boy, understanding her intent, yanked his leg free. The moment the pressure was gone, Abigail lost her purchase, and the trap slammed shut with a sickening clang that echoed through the arroyo. It sounded like a jail door closing. She stumbled back, breathing heavily, her muscles screaming in protest. The child lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding leg, his face a mask of silent agony. Abigail scrambled to his side with her medical supplies. "Let me see. Let me see it." The wound was ugly, a mangled mess of flesh and blood. Two deep, semicircular gashes were weeping, the skin around them already beginning to swell and discolor. Infection was the real enemy now. In this heat, with this filth, it could set in within hours. Without proper cleaning, he could lose the leg, or his life. "This will sting," she warned, uncorking the carbolic acid. She diluted it with a bit of precious water from her canteen, then gently but firmly began to clean the wound. The boy hissed in pain, his knuckles white where he gripped the dirt. But he did not cry out. He endured it with a stoicism that would have shamed men 3 times his age. Abigail worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. She bandaged the leg tightly with clean strips of linen, creating a thick pressure dressing. When she was done, she offered him the canteen. He looked at it, then at her, suspicion still warring with desperate need in his eyes. "Water," she said, pointing to her lips. "Drink." He took it and drank, long and deep. He was severely dehydrated, on the verge of collapse. When he handed it back, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first sign of trust, a tiny crack in the wall of fear between them. But now came the next impossible problem. He couldn't walk. She was not strong enough to carry him all the way back to her homestead, and to leave him here to get help was to leave him for the coyotes, or worse, for whoever set this vicious trap in the first place. This was Thorne's land. He could have men anywhere, listening, watching. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked gently. He remained silent, his gaze distant. He was likely in shock, the pain and terror overwhelming him. She knew she had to get him moving, get him to safety. "All right," she said, her voice taking on a new resolve. "We're going to get you home. My home. It's warm. It's safe." An idea formed in her mind. Using her knife, she cut away the sleeve of her own dress, then used the tough fabric to tie the splinting branch to his injured leg, immobilizing it against his thigh. It was a crude solution, but it might keep the wound from jostling too much. "I'm going to help you up," she explained using gestures. "You put your arm over my shoulder. We'll walk together, one step at a time." He seemed to understand. With a great deal of effort and a few sharp intakes of breath from the boy, they managed to get him upright. He was light, but it was still an awkward, grueling burden. He leaned heavily on her, his small body radiating heat and pain. She picked up her rifle, and they shuffled forward, a strange, wounded pair moving through the hostile night. Every step was a struggle. The darkness was complete now, save for a sliver of moon that offered little light and no comfort. They had been moving for what felt like an eternity when Abigail heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a coyote. It was hoofbeats. Several horses moving fast from the north, from the direction of the Hopi lands. A search party. A cold, sharp panic lanced through her. She stopped, her body frozen. How would this look? A white woman carrying a rifle, dragging an injured Hopi child through the dark. They wouldn't see a rescue. They would see an abduction. In this tense territory, accusations flew faster than bullets, and judgment was often delivered from the end of a rope. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, like a drumbeat of doom. A moment later, 3 riders crested a nearby ridge, their forms silhouetted against the starry sky. They were Hopi, their traditional dress unmistakable even in the gloom. They saw her. The lead rider let out a sharp cry, a sound of fury and grief, and in an instant, all 3 were galloping down the slope towards them, rifles raised, the thunder of their approach shaking the very ground beneath her feet. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She held the boy tighter, shielding him with her own body. This was it. Her act of kindness was about to get her killed. The riders bore down on them like a storm, dust flying from their ponies' hooves. Abigail stood her ground, her body a shield for the boy, her mind racing. Running was futile. Shouting would be lost in the thunder of their approach. All she could do was wait and pray they saw the truth before they pulled their triggers. The lead rider, a man with a stern, weathered face and long hair held back by a simple cloth band, reined his horse to a dramatic halt just feet away. The animal reared, its eyes wild as the man leveled his rifle squarely at Abigail's heart. His 2 companions fanned out, flanking her, their own weapons ready. There was no escape. "Tiva!" the lead rider exclaimed, his eyes finding the boy. Relief and pure fury warred on his face. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his gaze shifting from his son, for it was surely his son, to Abigail, his eyes narrowing into slits of raw hatred. "He was in a trap," Abigail said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "A coyote trap. I was bringing him to my home to tend his leg." The man ignored her. He spoke rapidly to the boy in the Hopi language, his voice a torrent of panicked questions. The child, Tiva, answered weakly, his small voice barely a whisper. He gestured with his head towards his bandaged leg, then back to Abigail. The man whose name she would learn was Hanavi knelt and gently touched the crude bandage she had made from her own dress. His expression was an unreadable mask of stone. He looked at the discarded, bloodied pieces of linen from her medical kit, then at the sleeve missing from her dress. His sharp eyes darted to the Winchester she still held. She hadn't even realized she was gripping it. Slowly, carefully, Abigail leaned the rifle against her leg and held up her empty hands. "I heard him cry out," she repeated, her voice desperate. "The trap was back in the arroyo. It belongs to a white man, a rancher." Onovi's gaze was piercing, searching her face for any sign of deception. In the tense silence, one of the other men dismounted and retrieved the canteen from her shoulder. He uncorked it, sniffed it. "Water," he said to Hanavi in accented English. It was a small thing, but it was evidence. A kidnapper wouldn't have given up their own water. Hanavi looked back at his son. Tiva spoke again, a longer stream of words this time, his gaze fixed on his father. As he spoke, a subtle shift occurred in Hanavi's rigid posture. The barest flicker of doubt crossed his features. He looked toward the arroyo. Tiva was now pointing towards, then back at the woman who stood before him, disheveled, exhausted, and protecting his child. Without another word, Hanavi lifted Tiva into his arms as if he weighed nothing. The boy winced but buried his face in his father's shoulder, a wave of relief washing over him. Hanavi turned to one of his companions and issued a quiet command in their native tongue. The man nodded, mounted his horse, and galloped off into the darkness, back towards the arroyo she'd indicated, to confirm her story. Hanavi then turned his gaze back to Abigail. The rifle of the remaining rider was still aimed at her chest. The air was thick with unspoken threats. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You live nearby?" Hanavi asked. His English was formal, heavy with an accent, but clear. "Yes, my homestead. It's just over that rise," she said, pointing. "The leg needs proper care. It's a deep wound. It needs to be kept clean. I have more supplies there. Hot water." Onobi considered this for a long, tense moment. His people's experience with white settlers was a bitter history of broken promises and violence. Trust was a currency they no longer possessed, but his son was injured, and the woman's story, supported by the evidence and his son's own words, was starting to hold the ring of truth. But what if it was a more elaborate trap? What if she was leading them into an ambush? "We will go to your house," he stated. It was not a request. It was an order. He mounted his pony with Tiva held securely in front of him. The other rider kept his rifle trained on Abigail as she retrieved her Winchester. She walked ahead of them, a prisoner in all but name, leading the way back to her own home. The short journey was agonizing, the silence broken only by the plodding of hooves. When the dim light of the lantern she'd left burning on her porch came into view, she saw Hanavi survey her small, hard-scrabble claim. It was a poor place, a place of struggle, not wealth. It did not look like the home of someone who would steal a child for ransom. Inside, the single room was sparse but clean. A simple bed, a rough-hewn table, a stone hearth. Hanavi laid Tiva gently on her bed. The boy looked exhausted but safe, his eyes already heavy with sleep. Abigail immediately set a pot of water on the hearth to boil. She laid out her remaining bandages, her bottle of carbolic, and a small jar of healing salve made from comfrey and yarrow, a recipe her grandmother had taught her. Onavi watched her every move, his posture rigid, his hand never far from the knife on his belt. The second rider stood guard by the door, a silent, intimidating sentinel. The air was thick with tension. This was not an alliance. It was a ceasefire, fragile and conditional, and Abigail knew it could be broken at any moment. The third rider returned just as the water began to steam. He spoke quietly to Hanavi, confirming everything. He had found the trap, the ironwood branch, and Abigail's tracks leading to and from it. He also confirmed, with a grim certainty, that the trap was the exact type used by Thorne's men on the T-Bar Ranch. The news seemed to settle something in Hanavi. The overt hostility in his eyes receded, replaced by a guarded, watchful curiosity. He gave a curt nod. "You spoke the truth." "I told you I did," Abigail replied, not with accusation, but with a simple weariness that was bone deep. She spent the next hour carefully unwrapping, cleaning, and redressing Tiva's wound with the hot water and fresh bandages. Hanavi watched her work, his sharp eyes missing nothing, the gentleness of her touch, the efficiency of her movements. He saw not a captor, but a healer. When she was finished, Tiva was fast asleep, his breathing deep and even. Abigail stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, her back aching. "He should stay here tonight," she said quietly. Moving him again might reopen the wound. Onobi looked at his sleeping son, his only son, then at Abigail. He gave another short, sharp nod. He walked to the door and spoke to his companions. They took the horses to her lean-to, sharing the small space with her mule, Jezebel, and began to make a small, smokeless fire outside. They were staying. Honavi did not leave the sod house. He took up a position in the corner, sitting on the floor with a blanket around his shoulders, his gaze alternating between his son and the woman who had saved him. He did not sleep. He watched, a silent guardian in the house of a stranger. Abigail, too exhausted to feel intimidated any longer, simply accepted it. She took a spare blanket and lay down on the rag rug before the hearth, the warmth of the embers a small comfort. She was sharing her home with armed men who had been ready to kill her an hour before. Yet strangely, she felt safer than she had in months. But she knew this fragile peace was temporary. Thorn had set that trap. He had intended for this child, to be found. But by whom? And why? The questions circled in her mind as she drifted into a restless sleep, knowing that the morning would bring answers, and likely more violence. Just before dawn, as the first gray light began to silhouette the windows, another sound broke the stillness. Heavy hoofbeats. Several riders approaching fast, but these were not the light, quick steps of Hopi ponies. This was the sound of heavy American horses, shod in iron. Abigail was instantly awake, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked at Honavi. He was already on his feet, his expression grim. He knew that sound too. Jedediah Thorn had come calling. Abigail scrambled to the door and peered through a crack. In the growing light, she saw Thorn himself on his big black gelding, flanked by two of his hard-faced ranch hands. And with them, looking uncomfortable and out of place, was Sheriff Brody. Thorn's eyes were fixed on the Hopi horses near her lean-to. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He had seen the horses, and he had drawn his own conclusions. This was his plan all along. He had orchestrated this entire scene. "Abigail Finch!" Thorn's voice boomed, shattering the morning peace. "By the authority of Sheriff Brody, I'm ordering you to come out. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive and colluding with savages against the good people of this county." The accusation hung in the air, vile and calculated. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was trying to legally and socially obliterate her, to paint her as a traitor. Inside the small house, Onabi drew his knife, its blade catching the faint light. Abigail looked from the armed, angry men outside to the proud, resolute father inside, and knew that the fragile peace of the night was about to be broken by a storm of violence. She was trapped between two worlds, and both were about to go to war right on her front porch. "Stay with your son," Abigail said, her voice a low, urgent command to Hanabi. "Do not show yourself, not yet." Hanabi's eyes questioned her, but he saw the steel in her face. He gave a single, sharp nod and moved back toward the bed where Tiva still slept, positioning himself out of sight from the doorway. Taking a deep breath to steady her hammering heart, Abigail pushed the heavy door open and stepped onto her porch. She held her hands out to her sides, empty, a deliberate show of non-aggression. The morning air was cool, but her skin felt hot with adrenaline. "Sheriff Brody," she said, her voice clear and steady, deliberately ignoring Thorn. "There's no fugitive here. What is the meaning of this?" Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose face was perpetually flushed from drink, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He couldn't quite meet her gaze. "Now, Abigail," he began, his tone placating and weak, "we got a report. One of Mr. Thorne's men saw Hopi riders heading for your claim late last night. It's my duty to investigate any unusual activity." "Unusual activity?" Thorne cut in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He nudged his horse forward, a predator closing in. "I'd call it more than unusual. I'd call it a conspiracy. First you refuse to sell, then you start welcoming their kind onto your land. What did they promise you, Abigail? A share of what they pilfer from honest ranchers like me?" His words were for the sheriff, for his men, painting a picture of a desperate woman turned traitor. "Your man," Abigail said, her eyes locking with Thorne's, cold and hard, "failed to report that he also set an illegal steel trap on my property line, a trap that nearly tore a child's leg off." This gave them pause. Brody's eyebrows shot up, and even Thorne's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "A child?" Brody asked, glancing nervously at Thorne. "Lies!" Thorne spat, recovering quickly. "A desperate story from a desperate woman. There was no trap. She's sheltering a thief, most likely. Probably the same one who's been running off my yearlings." His name is Tiva. Abigail's voice rang out, clear and defiant. He is 7 years old. His father is with him. They are in my home because the boy was injured and needed care. His father is a man named Hanavi. He is not a fugitive. He is a father who was searching for his lost son. She turned her gaze back to the sheriff, pressing her advantage. If you are here to uphold the law, Sheriff, then I demand you arrest Jedediah Thorne for endangerment and for setting a trap on federal homestead land. That is the law, is it not? The challenge hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Brody was trapped. To ignore her was to show his corruption plainly. To act on it was to defy the man who owned him. He licked his lips, his eyes darting between Abigail and Thorne. From inside the house, a new voice emerged, deep and resonant. The woman speaks the truth. Onovi appeared in the doorway. He was not holding a weapon. He stood tall and straight, his presence radiating an authority that had nothing to do with a tin star or a deed of land. It was the ancient authority of a leader and a father. My son Tiva carries the mark of the iron trap on his leg, Hanavi said, his eyes fixed on Sheriff Brody, dismissing Thorne completely. The trap was staked on this land. My men found it where she said it would be. This is the truth. If you are a man of law, you will see it. Thorne's face contorted with fury. The situation was slipping from his grasp. His simple plan to paint Abigail as a crazed sympathizer was being dismantled by the calm, dignified testimony of the very man he'd labeled a savage. This is a farce, Thorne roared, his composure cracking. You're going to take the word of an Indian over a white man? Over me. Before Brody could answer, Hanavi's two companions emerged from the side of the house, leading their ponies. They moved with a quiet, deliberate confidence that was more intimidating than any overt threat. They were outnumbered, but they were not afraid. Sheriff Brody looked at the scene, a resolute homesteader, 3 determined Hopi men, and a furious cattle baron. His courage, always a shallow well, ran bone dry. This was becoming far too complicated. It smelled of federal marshals and inquiries, things that made a small-town sheriff's life very difficult. There ain't no proof of who set any trap, Brody declared, his voice taking on a false bluster. And there ain't no fugitive, so there ain't no crime to be investigated here. This is a civil dispute. You all sort it out yourselves. He tipped his hat curtly. Mrs. Finch, Mr. Thorne, a good day to you. Without a backward glance, he turned his horse and trotted away, a coward fleeing the fire he'd helped to set. Thorne was left incandescent with rage. He had been publicly undermined and then abandoned by his own puppet. He glared at Abigail, his eyes promising a retribution that would be slow and painful. This isn't over, Abigail, he snarled, his voice low and venomous. You've made an enemy you can't afford. This land will be mine. I'll see you starve on it first. He wrenched his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around so sharply it snorted in protest, and galloped away, his men trailing behind him like vultures. In the sudden, ringing silence, Abigail felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it almost dropped her to her knees. She leaned against the porch rail, her body trembling. Hanavi stepped forward, his expression still stern, but the hostility was gone, replaced by something else. Respect. You have a strong spirit, he said. It was the highest of compliments. I'm just stubborn, she replied with a shaky smile. Later that morning, Hanavi deemed Tiva well enough to travel. He tried to offer Abigail payment, a fine silver and turquoise bracelet from his own wrist. Abigail held up a hand, refusing it. No, I did what anyone should have done. There is no payment for that. Hanavi studied her for a long moment, a deep understanding passing between them. He slid the bracelet back onto his arm. He spoke to his son, who looked at Abigail with his large, dark eyes, and whispered a single Hopi word she didn't understand, but felt in her heart. Thank you. She watched them ride north, a small procession disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. For the rest of the day, an unnerving quiet settled over the homestead. The confrontation had left her drained, and Thorne's threat echoed in the silence. She felt more alone than ever, a single tree in a vast empty prairie, waiting for the lightning to strike. That night she slept fitfully, the Winchester propped by her bed. The next morning she awoke with the dawn and stepped outside to begin her chores. She stopped dead on her porch, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. The plank floor was covered in gifts. It was not a treasure of gold or silver. It was a treasure of life. There were 3 large, intricately woven baskets filled to the brim with blue corn, beans, and dried squash. Beside them lay a stack of peaky bread, thin as paper and rolled into scrolls. There was a beautiful black, on-white clay pot, a masterpiece of Hopi artistry, filled with fresh, cool water. Draped over the porch railing were 2 thick, warmly woven wool blankets, their patterns telling stories of rain clouds and cornstalks. It was more than food and supplies. It was a statement. It was survival. It was enough food to last her through the winter. It was a message to anyone watching, and she knew Thorne's men would be watching, that Abigail Finch was not alone. She was under the protection of the Hopi nation. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as she touched the rough texture of a blanket. This was Hanabi's payment, not a trinket of silver, but the gift of life, a debt paid with a respect that money could never buy. But as she looked out at the vast, contested land, she knew this display of friendship would not deter Jedediah Thorne. It would enrage him. The gifts were a shield, but they were also a target. Thorne's next move, she suspected, would be far more dangerous than a simple trap in the dirt. And far to the south, in the territorial capital of Prescott, a telegram was already on its way. Reports of rising tensions between the T-Bar Ranch and the Hopi Nation, centered on a disputed homestead, had finally reached the desk of a man who, unlike Sheriff Brody, could not be bought. The storm was far from over. It was just gathering strength. For 2 weeks, an uneasy peace settled over the valley. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a thunderstorm, heavy, charged, and smelling of ozone. Abigail saw Thorne's riders on the distant ridges, their silhouettes like patient predators, but they kept their distance. The gifts on her porch remained untouched, a silent, powerful symbol that even Thorne was hesitant to defy directly. Abigail worked her land with a renewed sense of purpose, the baskets of food a constant reminder that she was no longer fighting this battle entirely on her own. The peace was broken not by a gunshot, but by the arrival of a stranger. He was a tall, lean man with a square jaw and weary eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the territory's ugliness. He rode a tired-looking buckskin and wore the plain, functional clothes of a traveler. But the Colt peacemaker holstered low on his hip was worn with the ease of long practice, and on his vest was a glint of silver, the star of a deputy U.S. Marshal. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat as he reined in before her porch, "name's Everett Shaw, Deputy U.S. Marshal. I've been sent down from Prescott to look into some disagreements in this area." Abigail felt a surge of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. Here finally was the law, the real law, not some puppet on a string. She invited him onto the porch, and over a cup of precious water from the Hopi pot, she told him everything. She left nothing out. Thorne's threats, the trap, Tiva's injury, the confrontation with Sheriff Brody, and the gifts from the tribe. Marshal Shaw listened intently, his gaze missing nothing. He inspected the Hopi pottery and blankets with a professional curiosity. "Thorne's been a burr under the territorial government's saddle for years," he said when she'd finished, his voice a low drawl. "He pushes, he bullies, but he's always been careful to stay just inside the lines of the law. This trap, though, that's a federal crime on homestead land. Problem is, it's your word, and the Hopi's against his." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "And we both know whose word carries more weight in a courtroom around here." "So you can't do anything?" Abigail asked, her hope beginning to fade as quickly as it had appeared. "I didn't say that," Shaw corrected her, a faint glint in his tired eyes. "I said it's difficult. Thorne's getting reckless. Men like that, when they get backed into a corner, they make mistakes. I'm going to be staying in the area, watching, waiting for him to make one." But Thorne was not a man to wait for events to unfold. He was a man who created them. The public alliance between Abigail and the Hopi had enraged him. A direct assault on her was now politically dangerous. So he devised a more sinister plan, one that would destroy both of his problems at once. He would create a catastrophe and pin the blame squarely on the tribe, using Abigail as the catalyst. His plan was devilishly simple, a cattle stampede. His vast herd was grazing in the high pasture bordering the canyon lands. To the north, nestled in a valley protected by the mesas, lay the Hopi's winter cornfields, their primary source of sustenance. A stampede through that valley would be an act of annihilation, ensuring a winter of starvation, forcing the tribe to either move or become dependent on government rations, breaking their independence forever. And the official story would be that the savages, emboldened by their new white ally, had carelessly set a fire that spooked the herd. It was a perfect, damnable plan. His foreman, a hardened drover named Booker, was tasked with setting the charge. But Booker had been one of the men with Thorn that morning at Abigail's cabin. He had seen the look on her face, the quiet dignity of Hanavi. More than that, he had a young son of his own back in Texas. The thought of a child in one of their traps had been eating at him. This new order, to deliberately cause the starvation of women and children, was a line he wasn't sure he could cross. One night, driven by a guilty conscience and a quart of cheap whiskey, Booker rode not towards the herd, but towards Abigail's homestead. He approached cautiously, staying in the shadows. "Mrs. Finch," he hissed from the darkness. Abigail came to the door, Winchester in hand. "Who's there?" "Don't shoot. It's Booker, from the T-bar." He stepped into the faint moonlight, his hands raised. "I ain't here to make trouble. I'm here to warn you." His words tumbled out, laced with fear and liquor. He told her of Thorne's plan, the stampede, time for the following night, and the intent to blame it on a fire set by the Hopi. "They're gonna plant evidence, ma'am. Make it look like the Hopi did it." "He's gone crazy," Booker finished, his voice trembling. "This ain't ranching. This is murder." He then wheeled his horse and vanished back into the night, a man fleeing his own demons. Abigail's blood ran cold. She had to warn them. But the mesas were a day's ride away. She would never make it in time. Then she remembered something Hanavi had told her during that long night in her cabin. He had spoken of the old ways, of the paths his people used, shortcuts through the labyrinthine canyons that only they knew. He had described a narrow hidden passage known as Echo Pass, which cut the journey by more than half. He had described its entrance, marked by a singular wind-twisted juniper tree that looked like a praying man. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had. She scribbled a hasty note for Marshal Shaw, hoping he would pass by as he'd promised, detailing Thorne's plot. She left it nailed to her door. Saddling the ever-reliable Jezebel, she set off into the treacherous dark, praying she could find a landmark she had never seen, in a land designed to kill the unwary. She was riding not just to save her friends, but to stop a massacre. Meanwhile, Marshal Shaw was not idle. In the town of Red Creek, he wasn't just investigating Thorne's recent activities. He was investigating Thorne himself. Something about the man's arrogance felt off, like he was overcompensating for a hidden weakness. Shaw had sent a detailed telegram to the U.S. Marshal's Central Records Office in Fort Smith, Arkansas, with Thorne's description and any known aliases. He was digging into the man's past, looking for the root of his evil. He rode out toward the Finch homestead the next afternoon to check on Abigail and found her note. His face went grim as he read it. The stampede was not just a possibility, it was happening. Now. He spurred his horse, not towards the Hopi lands, he knew he'd be too late, but towards Red Rock Canyon, a natural choke point through which the cattle would have to be funneled. He knew Thorne. A man like that wouldn't delegate the pleasure of watching his masterpiece unfold. He would be there, and Shaw would be waiting for him. Abigail found Echo Pass just as the sun began to rise, its entrance a mere crack in the canyon wall, almost invisible. The journey through it was harrowing, a tight squeeze through towering rock walls that scraped at her stirrups. But she emerged on the other side with the Hopi mesas in sight. She pushed Jezebel to her limit, arriving at the village as the elders were gathering for their morning council. Panting and dust-covered, she burst in and found Hanavi. "Thorne!" she gasped. "He's going to stampede his herd. Tonight! Through your cornfields!" A wave of alarm spread through the council. Hanavi's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. There was no time to move the women and children. They had to stop the herd. He gave a series of rapid commands. Within minutes, a party of 20 mounted warriors was assembled, armed with rifles and a fierce determination to protect their homes. Abigail, refusing to be left behind, was given a fresh pony and rode with them. They galloped back towards the valley, Honavi leading them through another series of ancient paths only they knew. They arrived at the mouth of the valley just as the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows. In the distance they could hear it, a low, growing rumble. The stampede had begun. From a high vantage point overlooking the valley, Thorn and two of his most loyal men watched, their faces lit by the dying sun. Thorn held a lit cigar, a satisfied smirk on his face. Victory was at hand. "That's far enough, Thorn." A calm voice cut through the air. Thorn spun around. On the ridge behind him sat Marshal Everett Shaw, his shotgun held loosely, but pointedly in Thorn's direction. "Marshal," Thorn said, his voice dangerously smooth. "Enjoying the sunset?" "I'd enjoy it more if I wasn't about to arrest you for conspiracy to destroy property and incite a riot," Shaw said calmly. Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You have no proof. It's my word against a hysterical woman and a band of primitives." "Oh, I think I have a bit more than that," Shaw said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. A telegram. "Took a while for the reply to get back from Fort Smith. Seems they know a man matching your description. A man with a taste for land, grabs, and bullying. But they don't know him as Jedediah Thorn." Shaw let the name hang in the air. "They know him as Alistair Blackwood, a banker from St. Louis who embezzled a fortune from his clients and fled west after setting fire to the bank to cover his tracks. There's a federal warrant for your arrest that's 10 years old." The smirk vanished from Thorn's, or Blackwood's, face. He was exposed. The carefully constructed identity he had built was shattered. All the power, all the fear he commanded was based on a lie. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape. He saw none. In that moment of pure desperation, his hand dropped to his pistol. It was the mistake Shaw had been waiting for. But before Blackwood could even clear leather, another sound split the air. Not a gunshot, a war cry. From the mouth of the valley below, Honavi and his riders appeared. They weren't charging the cattle. They were creating a wall of sound and fury. They fired their rifles into the air. They yelled. They waved blankets, a terrifying, chaotic display. The lead cattle, already spooked, shied away from the noise and the fire. The stampede, deprived of its leaders, began to break, turning back on itself in confusion. The herd was being turned. Up on the ridge, seeing his plan crumble and his past exposed, Alistair Blackwood made his choice. He wasn't going to hang. He spurred his horse not at Shaw, but toward the canyon edge, a sheer drop of 500 feet. "Thorn, no!" Shaw yelled, but it was too late. Blackwood and his horse leaped into the abyss, a final desperate act of defiance. They disappeared into the deep shadows below. The other two henchmen, seeing their boss gone and a U.S. Marshal before them, threw down their guns and surrendered immediately. The rumbling from the valley subsided, replaced by the victorious cries of the Hopi warriors. Down below, Abigail sat on her pony between Honavi and his men, watching the last of the cattle turn and flee. The cornfields were safe. The valley was safe. The war was over. The aftermath was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Jedediah Thorn, the man who was really Alistair Blackwood, was gone. His body shattered at the bottom of Red Rock Canyon. His empire, built on lies and intimidation, crumbled overnight. His men scattered, his cattle were impounded by the marshal's office, and the T-Bar Ranch was seized by the federal government. Marshal Shaw's official report was simple. Thorn, acting alone in a fit of madness, had attempted to destroy Hopi property and had taken his own life when confronted. But he made sure the official record noted Abigail Finch's role as a heroic citizen who had prevented a tragedy. Sheriff Brody, disgraced by his association with a wanted federal embezzler, quietly resigned and vanished from the territory. Abigail returned to her homestead. The journey back felt vastly different from the desperate ride out. She was no longer just a survivor clinging to a patch of dirt. She was a part of the land's story. When she arrived, she found Honavi and two of his men waiting for her on the porch. They had repaired her fence, which had been damaged weeks before, and had refilled her water barrels from a hidden spring she never knew existed. There were no grand speeches. Words were not Hanava's way. He simply stood before her as she dismounted. "The people thank you," he said, his voice resonating with deep sincerity. "The corn will feed the children this winter because of your courage. Our home is safe." "Your home was never mine to save," Abigail replied, stroking Jezebel's dusty neck. "I just warned my friends that a snake was in their path." Onovi allowed a rare small smile to touch his lips. He looked at her small sod house, at the gifts that still adorned her porch. "This land has a way of testing a person's heart," he said, his gaze sweeping over the horizon. "Yours is strong, like the roots of the juniper tree." He placed a hand over his own heart in a gesture of profound respect, then mounted his pony. "You are not alone, Abigail Finch. Remember that." He and his men rode away, leaving her in the peaceful silence of her own land. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the sound of isolation. It was the sound of peace. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The threat was gone. The shadow of the T-bar no longer loomed over her. But the gifts remained. Occasionally, she would find a small pouch of herbs left on her porch rail, or a brace of rabbits cleaned and ready for the pot. She, in turn, would sometimes leave a jar of her wild berry preserves or a few extra eggs where she knew a Hopi shepherd might pass. It was a quiet, unspoken language of friendship. One evening, as a gentle sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and lilac, a peaceful contrast to the bloody red of that fateful day, Abigail sat on her porch. She was still a woman alone, and life was still hard. But she was not lonely. Her home was no longer just a 160-acre plot of land. It was a place anchored in community, respected by her neighbors, and protected by a promise that weighed more than all the gold in the territory. The porch, once a symbol of her vulnerability, was now her throne, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the simple act of helping a stranger. The story of Abigail Finch and the Hopi child is a powerful testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, the strongest alliances can be forged. It's a reminder that true courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. Her simple act of human decency didn't just save a life. It brought down a corrupt empire and built a bridge of respect between two cultures. The gifts left on her porch were more than just a reward. They were a symbol that echoes through time, a message that kindness is a currency that even the most remote and unforgiving frontiers understand and honor. If this story of unexpected heroism and quiet strength moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps us share these incredible tales with more people. Don't forget to share this piece of the Old West with your friends and family. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the annals of history. We're dedicated to uncovering the forgotten legends and unsung heroes of the past. Thank you for listening.